I'm speaking in good faith today with Rabbi Joe Charnes. Joe, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Looking forward to our dialogue.
He received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from California State University, Northridge, and went on to study in traditional Jewish seminaries in Los Angeles, California, Brooklyn, New York, and Jerusalem, Israel, and ordained by Rabbi Mordecai Finley, PhD of the Academy for Jewish Religion in California. His teachings center around recovering and encountering the inner dimension of sacred Jewish wisdom. I'm excited to ask about that.
Wow, who wrote that? That was good.
He is deeply devoted to interfaith dialogue and engagement and has been involved in numerous Jewish, Christian, interfaith, and multi-faith events and has studied Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism comparatively for over 25 years, more recently Islam and Hinduism, lectured at seminaries, universities, churches, synagogues, mosques, and military bases across the country. He's married to his beautiful wife, Sarah Schechter, also a rabbi. She's a chaplain in the U.S. Air Force. They live in Monterey, California. Moment of jealousy for me here. And their lovely daughter, Yael Emuna, is with us today in the control room. Rabbi Joe Charnes, when do you first remember in your life, even just growing up, that religion and God was something important? I mean, did you just live and breathe that in the house you grew up in, or was that a later discovery?
No, that's a very interesting question. We didn't grow up in a particularly observant household focused on divine interaction or connection or service. We grew up more. This is probably a different discussion, but there's an aspect of the Jewish community that has a Jewish reference and a Jewish heart, but they've developed a very different way of living outside of what would be the normal parameters of Jewish law. And that's again another discussion as to why. But they raised me as a Jew, but not as an observant Jew, a practicing Jew, a kosher Jew, a holiday-observing Jew, but a Jew aware that he was a Jew and who had a good reason and purpose and meaning for being Jewish, but we don't live it in this form. We live it in this form. And over the years, I moved much more into a formal-oriented or a form-based practice of Judaism that also includes the inner dimension of the awareness of the sacred in life and among our fellow human beings.
What did you feel drawing you? What was it that pulled you in that direction or made you seek that?
In life, we read about, in school certainly, that's where it happened, later years of high school. In our studies, I received a lot of information about, but it never gave me answers to. It was never a grounding sort of informational basis. It was always speaking more about, rather than the reason why or the reasons behind or the reasons within. And so I began looking at philosophy, which deals with ultimately the root word itself deals with the love of wisdom. And wisdom is certainly a value that we should all honor and seek to develop within us as far as this content. We should have a wisdom-based life. But philosophy drew me ultimately back to the wisdom of my own soul, of who I am organically and historically. Not in any way discounting the philosophical wisdom, because that was a minor of mine. I studied philosophy in college to understand the different philosophies. But I then began to look into the philosophy of my own soul, of my own history, of my own faith community. And I worked slowly into that world of wisdom and then began to live that wisdom in life. Because wisdom of mind or wisdom of heart in Jewish thought is not the end or the goal or the purpose of wisdom. It's to live a life filled with that wisdom as you engage with your fellow human being. That's how wisdom must be manifested in life. So that's how it started off with, essentially in one form, nothing as far as practice and deep awareness of the inner dimension of Judaism. And through the study of wisdom, my own soul was awakened to the call of wisdom from my own distant past. And I answered that call. And I listened to many other voices of wisdom too, as we'll probably discuss. But that was I think the moment where I said, like in Isaiah, when God asks Isaiah, whom shall I send? And he says, Hineni, right? Here I am, send me.
Send me.
So send me to myself. I'm listening to the call, and I'm open to see where it leads me.
That's a really beautiful idea of even the purpose or the concept of wisdom. I'd like to maybe break that into two parts about communities. And the first one is, if I can admire any religious tradition for finding a way to preserve identity through the vagaries of history and centuries of not even having a homeland, it's the Jewish community, whether it's Orthodox, Reform, secular, whatever. That identity, that sense of community is really something I admire how that's been passed on. Let me ask, within the community, what is it, whether it's ritual or interaction, that connects you with the divine?
The connection with the divine, or connections, I'll say connections because there are many, many ways of connecting, not only within Judaism, but within the model of the sacred through all of our faith traditions. Judaism is not exclusive in how we connect with the divine. The divine, at least as I understand it, and I think it's not how Judaism literally says it, but I'm just expressing the idea. Judaism doesn't have one way up that sacred mountain to meet our Maker. If God is infinite, then there can't be, in my theology or in my approach to Judaism, there can't simply be one way of accessing the infinite. There has to be at least two. No, just kidding. There has to be more than one way. So within Judaism, one way of connecting is through ritual observance. And what we would call Jewish law, as it's commonly termed, the Jewish law or the commandment. And that has a very different echo in the Christian world than it does in the Jewish world. The law is not the means by which we are redeemed or saved, if you want to use that language. In Judaism, the law is something much more enduring and beautiful and honored and respected. It's not apart from the law, as Paul would say, for example, in Romans 3. It's apart from the law is the righteousness of God. For us, it's within the context of law. And I know there are different ways of interpreting Paul, right? But that again, is not my purpose here today to discuss the nuance of Paul. Much of Protestant thought certainly has removed law as the way of redemption. The way that we understand, or one way we in the Jewish world understand what law means, is it comes from the Hebrew word mitzvah is a commandment. Halacha is law. And interestingly, the word halacha, which means law, its root meaning has nothing to do with law. Its root meaning has to do, it's literally to walk or to go. In other words, the way you walk in life, it's the way you live. It is simply the way you live. It's your way into divine intimacy. That's halacha. That's a rabbinic term. The biblical terminology for the commandment is mitzvah, and it has the root word in it of tzava, which just means it's command. It's to command. But the rabbis relate that word. Here's where I think as you nuance or dig deeper within the sacred term or the sacred text, you'll find that there are much deeper dimensions, right? A well, if you want to get to those waters that are deep below the surface, you have to dig deeply to get to the wellspring. And it's the same thing with the sacred. You can't just look at the term or the sentence and have the meaning. Jewish The commandment itself comes from the word tzava, which means to command, but the rabbis say it's also related to the word for tzavta, which means to connect or to join. So, yes.
So a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah,
Yes.
is that the connecting point?
Yes, ultimately, one way that we are joining with or connecting with transcendence is through observance of sacred ritual. It can be formalized and it can be empty in content, and it can have no inspiring dimension in your life. It can leave you empty. But the ultimate purpose of mitzvah, of commandment, is tzavta, is to connect with self, to connect with community, and to connect with the source of all of existence.
So outside of the Jewish community specifically, it seems to me, and you correct me on this, that connecting with people of other faiths and traditions, would you say that's part of your observance or your worship? It seems very important to you.
For me, I would say it's not only part, it's central. It is part of my Jewish life. That hasn't been, I would say, very common even in today. It's more common among some. In the past, it wasn't even a potential because we weren't allowed. The only time we had dialogues like this in the past was when we were forced into a dialogue with, say, the church. And if we did well, we were in trouble, or a debate. We did well, we were in trouble because we did well. And if we did poorly, our community was in trouble because they would possibly leave. So for me, the call of interfaith, and I simply live with this awareness and this. It's a meditation. It's a walking meditation. I believe in the words of what is called Mishnah. It's the foundational legal tradition of the Jewish faith. It's written down about 1,800 years ago, or codified, I should say, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, about 1,800 years ago. And in the Mishnah itself, in this legal codification, this system, there's a section called Pirkei Avot, which deals with more ethical or soulful matters, those that are beyond the mere letter or form of the law. It says within a legal text itself, here are ways beyond or within the law, or into the deeper dimensions of the sacred ritual. And in chapter 4, it asks a question. It says, Ben Zoma is his name. He asks 4 questions, but we'll only start with the first. And he asks, Ezehu Chacham, who is wise? And his answer, I've asked this question before people, and his answer is often very similar to what some come up with. Gratefully, I'm grateful. He says, who is wise? And on the simple translation, it says, one who learns from every person. Well, that immediately got an amen from me. But when you analyze it even more in the Hebrew, that's a fine translation. Why is this call to learn about others so deeply ingrained in my heart? Because it's right there in the legal text. If you're seeking wisdom, who is a wise person? It's one who is learning. In the Hebrew, it's in a participle, which is an ongoing sense. One who is learning from every person. And the Hebrew word there for person, we have many words for person or mankind. It uses the most general or generic term. So it says to me, if I want wisdom, I have to be sure that I am learning in an ongoing manner from every person, not from every great rabbi or every saint or every sage, but from every human being in an ongoing, regular, committed, dedicated, and devoted practice. So how can I not seek the wisdom from the other manifestations of the divine in your faith tradition and the other faith traditions? That's why I'm so deeply called to this practice or this way.
And such an interesting thing to me is it seems to also, that respect and that ongoing learning increases your spirituality, but does not seem to lessen at all your commitment to the tradition you're from?
You know, this is a fascinating question you ask, because my daughter recently asked me, do some of your studies of other faith traditions that have deep, deep wisdom, do they ever cause you to have questions or make you think? Maybe. And the answer, honestly, is, and I say this with honor, pride, with a thank God, yes, it does. Because there's a great Rebbe, not a rabbi, but a Rebbe. It's a different kind of rabbi. The Rebbe of the Kotzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kotz, from a couple of hundred years ago. They wear the black coats and the black hats and the long curlicues, the Hasidim. And he says, if you can't see God everywhere, you can't see God anywhere. Now, I'm sure he's spinning over in his grave right now thinking, I didn't mean that, Joe. But
not that everywhere.
But that's, to me, everywhere means everywhere. And one of the names of God in Judaism, by the rabbis, is Hamakom, which means the place. Well, that means every place to me. The place that you are, the place that she is, the place that we are, is the place of the divine. God's name is called the place because every place you are is the place of the divine, if you choose to receive it, if you choose to dwell with it, and if you choose to allow it to dwell that place within you. So it does sometimes cause me questions, genuine, seeking, searching questions, because I find it such a beautiful and honorable and wise teaching, yet sometimes it seems to be parting ways from some of my own tradition's wisdom. So I have to then learn to wrestle with how. And there's a beautiful teaching. Again, I don't have the answers. I might have a foot in both sometimes. But there's a beautiful teaching from an Episcopal priest who's no longer with us. I believe his last name is pronounced Capon. I don't know if it's Capon or Capon. But he wrote a book, several books. One of them was a cookbook called The Supper of the Lamb. And my wife has it, and she's the one who introduced me to it. And he has a teaching there that I have said publicly, boy, I wish the rabbis came up with this one, because I bow down to this. He says, paradox is the only basket large enough to hold truth. Well, there I am. I am living in the paradox of divine wisdom that isn't linear. And thank God, that isn't black and white, thank God, that calls me in many different ways, but allows my root to remain rooted, and I blossom, and sometimes there may be cross-pollination. But that's rich, and it's enriching, but it doesn't change the richness of my faith.
I'm going to try and put words in your mouth.
I probably said too many. So
no, which is, I don't know if it's the right word. But it's not fear. And some people have fear when that they might be threatened in some way, that they will, maybe it's their root isn't deep enough in the original source, that they worry that this other wisdom will somehow be threatening. I'll just say the word. To me, it's love. Maybe there's a better word, but it's an openness to God speaking in various ways.
Well, that's a great question, actually. Fear that you mentioned, that you picked up on this aspect of fear. It's not fear, but in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for fear, one of the Hebrew words for fear, also means reverence. So we can, like to revere.
In awe of.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a major wow, because sometimes we confuse the two. And we isolate the fear outside of a context of reverence. There is something awe-inspiring. But if it's grounded in reverence, it's very different. If your reverence is grounded in fear, that's a different engagement. And I see reverence in my sacred explorations. I don't see fear of exploring the sacred, because our Hebrew Bible, it's divided into three parts, what you would call in English the books of Moses, and then the prophets, and then the writings. That's how we define them. The book of Moses, or the 5 books of Moses, according to the rabbis, are called Torah. And Torah doesn't mean law. I know that's how it's translated often by people or in the New Testament when it translates it as namas. It translates law as namas, which means in Greek law. But in Hebrew, that word also means instruction. So it's a much broader aspect or dimension of law. It's there to instruct, not simply to limit or correct or guide you on this one path. It's not a linear term. It is instructional, and we can learn from. But like in all areas of learning, whether it's in science or music or art, there are layers. We can get that initial layer, that surface layer that we need. When you're in grammar school or in grade school and you learn about photosynthesis, it's not going to be as complex as you're learning as a biochemist or as a biologist.
Yeah.
It's all rooted in the same. And I would say the same thing about the sacred. I have no fear. I only have reverence because of the infinite layers that are there before us that cannot uproot us. They can only deepen us. And I get in trouble for this, and maybe we should edit this out, but I ultimately have no grief when a person of one faith who seeks out the wisdom of their own just simply doesn't relate and finds another way into the heart of the divine. Period. How can I judge them for not finding meaning in a faith that they gave an honest attempt at finding, at searching through to discover, and it simply didn't work? They found it in another way, and for me that is another way in, not another way out. I always say, seek first your own. Learn about the wisdom from within, from respectable and profound scholars, not from somebody who is without. Don't learn about Judaism ultimately or solely from a Protestant tradition that may be critiquing it. It may be a fair critique, but first learn from within and then look at the surrounding approaches, both honoring and critical of, so you can have a real sense. And if that does ultimately call you in, I say, wonderful. But if, for whatever reason, you hear a different call, just like with diet, just like with music, I don't believe there's one way into the soul. And I have to honor that, even if it means they've left the soul of my tradition. I respect people's faith. I don't fear the difference. I have reverence, thankfully, and not fear as my root, even though they are the same Hebrew word. But we can focus on one or the other. But we need both. But for me, the grounding is reverence. And that's why I'm not afraid. I'm only inspired by the wisdom. I go through Come Follow Me, believe it or not. I've been doing it for 5 years since it started. And trust me, I'm a better person. I'm a deeper person. And I think I'm even a better Jew because of it.
So I have 2 or 3 questions that could each be at least an hour discussion. I don't know if we can try and just briefly touch on these. How do you recognize truth? Maybe the reverence or the awe that you talked about is part of it, but when you're speaking with people or learning, is it some sort of sense? Is it a spiritual sense? Is it a physical perception? Maybe this is different for everyone. I realize I'm putting you on the spot with this, but I'm just so curious if you have a response to that. It's only one of the deep questions of the universe.
I think I'm going to go Buddhist on you and just sit here and meditate.
Well, good, because my next question is Buddhist. So it would be a good segue.
The truth is, in that same Mishnah that we spoke of before, of Pirkei Avot, the one that helps you go, I don't mean beyond the letter of the law in the sense of we don't need law, that Mishnah, the legal foundation. It means going beyond merely the outward form of the law into the soul that animates law. So I'm going to give you another quote from that same Mishnah, or not a different chapter, but that same book that speaks of, here is what we do in life. Here is how we live. It speaks of silence, and there's nothing better for the body, better than for your being, than silence. And maybe my answer would be better if I were silent to this question, but we'll give it a shot. What I will do ultimately, and in this case I'll quote you from another book that we have in our oral tradition. Judaism is not simply a written scriptural tradition. We have a written basis, which is the Bible. That's the foundation. But we also have what's called the oral law. There's the written law and the oral law. And the oral law is made up of two parts, of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So that's just the oral component. And we have many other aspects types of writing, but in the legal context, we call that also the Talmud, which comes from the root of learning. Okay, so this is our oral learning about the written, but this is filling out the written, because the written was never meant to be the fullness of the text. This was what I call the crib notes, but it assumes you've heard the lecture. The Talmud is more of the lecture, and the crib notes remind you of what you heard. So the Bible is there as the basis, but the Talmud and the oral tradition fill out or draw out what's often there that isn't clearly understood. In the Talmud, it speaks of, it's a beautiful teaching. It says, teach your tongue to say, I don't know. Okay? So if I had two themes to put on my tombstone, it would be learn from every person and teach your tongue to say, I don't know. Because that's a beautiful balance of learning and humility. And so I would say, as far as truth, the only thing I can tell you, or two things that I can tell you that may not answer the how, because I don't think there is a how. I think there are potential ways that we can, hear me on this, potential ways that we will all misunderstand absolute truth, because we are finite beings, and truth is ultimately infinite. And it's the mind of God, and it is the soul of God. God is ultimately truth. We are finite and can never understand the fullness of the infinite wisdom and truth of the divine wisdom, but we seek with humble hearts and inspired minds to understand to our best ability that there is truth, yes. In Hebrew, there is no plural for the Hebrew word truth. It's just emes or emet, if you speak modern Hebrew.
It's all one.
Yeah, we wouldn't say, maybe in modern Hebrew but it's one because it's telling you there is ultimately one truth. There might be many ways into that one truth, but there is absolutely one truth. But what's fascinating, the rabbis bring down that the letters for the Hebrew word for truth in the alphabet, the three letters of the word are the beginning letter of the alphabet, the middle letter of the alphabet, and the last letter of the alphabet. So what that tells me is not that I can gain or fully understand truth. It tells me, one, that there is truth, and two, that the beginning and the middle and the end of my focus in life should be to understand and seek to grow in that wisdom called truth. But I'm going to fail, and that's why I need to learn from others. So I don't have the how, but it certainly starts with an open heart and a searching mind. Those are two components that are foundationally necessary to understand. We have to have study, meaning mind, but we also have to have a heart that is willing to hear and receive and bring it to life, because we need both heart and mind in our service.
It seems like that combination is maybe that wisdom being brought forth usefully into the world that you referred to earlier.
Yes, it has to be lived. And you know what's interesting? What we call a wise person in Judaism, we don't say he's a wise person. We say he's a Talmud Chacham. He's a student of wisdom. Because the truth is, we can never truly appropriate wisdom, because we're all finite human beings. So we're always going to miss the mark to some extent.
So you talked about always learning in progress. Yeah. In a little bit of research we've been able to do since the short time we've known you were coming, you talk about the difference, I think, and you can correct me on my terminology, and this is the Buddhist part.
Okay.
The difference between being and becoming. Can you tell me Can you encapsulate that in a few sentences? Is that possible?
Yes and no.
Okay, now we're going Zen. So
now I'm going silent.
We'll give the audience a moment to ponder.
There you go. Being is who we are. Becoming is who we have the potential to be if we nurture, if we cultivate, if we tend, and ultimately allow that harvest to take place. But that comes from a discipline, from a practice. That comes from being a disciple, which has the root meaning of learning. It's foundational to all of our traditions. There has to be learning. It's not just spirit. Spirit is necessary, but there has to be grounding in learning and grounding in wisdom. And so who we are, I don't think it's static, first of all. There might be on some level well beyond anything I can understand as far as the nature of existence. There might be some enduring aspect to being. I would actually say that's God. Because the Hebrew name for God, one of the Hebrew names for God is made up of the letters, what you call in English Jehovah, right? That word in Hebrew has the letters that make up the name for Jehovah in Hebrew, make up in Hebrew, is, was, and will be. So that to me speaks of enduring existence, continuity of being, ever was, ever is, and ever will be, but always being. That's a level that is well beyond us, because we have become. But I think we always have an aspect that is rooted in the being of all of existence, the being that is behind and that brings into life all of existence. We are rooted in. We're not that being, but we have an aspect of. That's who we are. But how that blossoms, how that becomes, how that is brought forth is different. But it's rooted in wisdom. It's rooted in the sacred. It's rooted in a discipline of learning about the source behind all of existence, so we can become more of that aspect of who we ultimately are rooted in. So it's a grounding versus a blossoming. We are grounded but not static, so that we can blossom into becoming. It is a beautiful, beautiful practice, because it's always becoming. In fact, when God says in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 3, what's your name? What's your name? Well, who do I tell them sent me? When Moses says to the bush.
Right.
God doesn't say, I don't know how it's translated in the King James. My sense is it would probably be, is it I am or is it I shall be?
I am that I am.
Okay. It's not wrong. The question is, and this is a real grammatical question, Hebrew doesn't have a present tense form, I am, for the verb to be. It uses a future tense, I will be, I shall be. Now the question is, can it mean both? Probably. But then the bigger question is, then why didn't a holy language have a present tense word for being, I am?
I love that you're having a Talmudic discussion with yourself.
Yes. And please feel free to interrupt, because in the Talmud, the rabbis always interrupt and tell you where they're wrong. That's where you misunderstood. So please feel free. This is beautiful. I would simply say, taking it on one level, that when it says Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, I will be, that's if you read it independently, you would think it says I will be. So on this level, it's a legitimate read, and I am also is. But on the simplest level, I will be also has that idea of God is not static. God is always becoming, not in terms of God, but in terms of availability to us. How I experience name, when it wants to know a name, it's telling you essence. The essence of God is I will be who I will be. Because as you grow in awareness of the I am, who ultimately is I am, not changing, not before, not after, always being, but to us, always becoming. That's the I will be, is I will be more to you as you become more aware of me. That's my name, because again, name in Hebrew means essence. The name, the essence of the one who sent me will always be becoming to you as you grow in your awareness. So being and becoming is a dynamic dance. It's not a static dance. We always are becoming until we end up grounded and rooted in pure being. Because that's what we've become. We ultimately blossom into purity of being. But it's a process of becoming. Being becomes and ends in being. And that's where we are and always will be, because it's never static. Becoming leads to being, which becomes to becoming, lives to being, and grows into becoming. It's an infinite pattern or process of growth in the awareness of the sacred and the divine.
Which I love, that there's something for us to be about until we draw our last breath. I love that.
You know what happens when a Jew, theoretically, again, this is what we're supposed to do that we're often not able to do. At our last breath, right before we die, you know what a Jew is supposed to say? Again, this is a theology. It's not a literal practice, because we can't. We don't know when we're going to die. But it says we're supposed to say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. As I leave here, I am entering into that absolute oneness, so that I can become again and end up in being again. But it ends with there is one. Yeah. There is always one we can rely on and enter into, even when we're going beyond.
That's the Shema?
Yes.
You can pick your last question of these two.
Okay.
And I wish we had another hour.
Thank you. Sorry.
I would love to know if you, in a sense of connection to that oneness, that is what truly is, truth and God, do you feel that you receive responses or direction, whether that might be prayer or nudges, or perhaps, and this might be a different angle if you prefer, do you feel a sense of mission that has been given to you? Not just that you have decided, but there's something pushing you, or that made you to be the person with what you do, the need for that.
Made, for your last question, made, not made, no. Need, that made me or inspired me to need to be on a mission of this nature, I would say yes, because the call was given, and I said, send me. I answered the call. I believe that mission is offered, but I don't have to answer that call. So I do feel that there is that, because we are all grounded in the same humanity and the person of God. That is who we all originate from. And in the biblical model, whether you take the story of Adam and Eve literally or metaphorically, there was one. There was a grounding family, an initial family that we're all rooted from. So if you take it symbolically, it's easy. If you take it literally, it's easy. We all come from one. So there is a dimension or an aspect that we all share with each other, and that by serving our brothers and sisters, we are healing and bringing us back into that oneness of family. We are a family that we have lost sight of. We have become tribes and tribal. But there is a grander vision within the sacred that can allow us to be one family as we serve in our different ways. And in fact, in the temple, according to the rabbis, there were 12 gates that each tribe went to, or into the temple through. So Reuben would go into the gate of Reuben, and Judah wouldn't. He would go into Judah's gate. So we all have our own individual ways. However, the rabbis teach there was a 13th gate that everybody entered. And 13 is a significant number in Judaism. It's the 13 attributes of God. Okay, in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, it's about He's merciful, and all of the wonderful traits that we revere in God. There is a gate that we can all travel through together in our walk in life. And it's a divine service. It's leading us into the heart of the temple. And it's all of us together. But we each also need our own individual ways, just like we all have our own individual languages. Neither language, Greek, Hebrew, French, Spanish, Arabic, they're all beautiful languages. And we need each one of them, but none is better than the other. And we all have the final, ultimate language that we can speak, which is our humanity. That's what calls us all together. And that's what calls me. And that's what I hope I am able to listen to that calling and follow that calling and learn about my own sacred call and the caller, the one calling from above, by hearing your wisdom and their wisdom, so that I can more deeply hear my own wisdom, so that we can all walk through our own individual gates into our sacred temple sanctuary. But ultimately we can also walk together. And I do feel it. It is a calling. I'll leave the first question for another time. But it's not a mandate. It's a mission, but it was given. But I have ultimate choice or agency in your language. And the problem is, for all of us, we fail to hear the call. And that's why the first prayer that we teach a Jew when they're young is the Shema, to hear, to learn, to listen. The last prayer a Jew says on his lips is, I heard, Shema, I heard. I know there is one. And hopefully we can live our lives from the beginning moment of listening to our last moment of dying surrendering into listening. I hope we can live in between those moments, listening to each other, learning from each other, walking together with each other, and ultimately making this world a more heavenly place, because we need each other to do it.
The image of the temple gates is really beautiful and really applicable to what we've been discussing. Rabbi Joe Charnes, thank you for speaking with me today in good faith.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.